Sarah Chen sat quietly in her wheelchair at the corner table of Rosewood Restaurant, watching the chocolate cake in front of her with its single lit candle that flickered like her fading hope, while her fingers traced nervous patterns on the white tablecloth as she tried not to look at the empty chairs around her, especially the one where her father, David Chen, the famous tech CEO, should have been sitting right now on her 12th birthday. But instead she had received his text message just 30 minutes ago, saying that an emergency board meeting had come up and he would try to make it later, though she knew what later meant in his vocabulary, which was usually never. And the waitress, Maria, had been so kind, bringing out the cake and singing happy birthday in a soft voice that wouldn't draw too much attention from other diners. But now Maria had retreated to give her privacy, and Sarah felt more alone than ever as she watched families at nearby tables sharing meals and laughter. A father helping his young son cut his steak at one table while a mother wiped sauce from her daughter's chin at another, making her chest tighten with an ache that had become familiar over the past 3 years since the car accident that had taken away her ability to walk and somehow also taken away her father's ability to look at her without that expression of guilt and grief that made her feel like a living reminder of everything that had gone wrong. And she remembered how different birthdays used to be when her mother was alive, filled with homemade decorations and silly games, and her father actually smiling and present, not buried in his phone or laptop. But that was before the drunk driver had crashed into their car on that rainy November night, taking her mother instantly and leaving Sarah with a spinal injury that doctors said meant she would never walk again. Though sometimes she wondered if losing her father's attention hurt worse than losing her legs. And now here she was on her 12th birthday, making a wish on a candle while tears threatened to spill from her eyes. But she refused to let them fall, because crying in public would only make things worse. So she took a deep breath and whispered happy birthday to me, so quietly that even she could barely hear it. Then leaned forward to blow out the candle, watching the smoke curl up and disappear just like her hopes for this day had vanished. And she picked up her fork to take a bite of the cake, even though her throat felt too tight to swallow anything. When suddenly, a shadow fell across her table, and a gentle voice said, "Excuse me, miss," making her look up to see a tall black man with salt and pepper hair and the kindest brown eyes she had ever seen, standing there holding the hand of a little girl who couldn't have been more than 8 years old. And the man continued with a warm smile, "My daughter Zoe and I were wondering if we could join you, because all the other tables seem to be full, and we noticed you have extra seats here." Which was strange because Sarah could clearly see at least 3 empty tables in the restaurant. But something about the way he said it, the way his eyes held understanding rather than pity, made her realize he had been watching her sit alone and had decided to do something about it. And the little girl named Zoe was practically bouncing on her toes with excitement, her braided hair decorated with colorful beads that clicked softly as she moved, clutching a wrapped present in her small hands. And before Sarah could even respond, Zoe burst out with infectious enthusiasm, "It's my birthday too." "Well, actually it was yesterday, but Daddy said we could celebrate today because he had to work yesterday at the hospital. And I see you have cake, and cake is my favorite thing in the whole world, except for maybe pizza and my hamster Mr. Whiskers." And the way she said it all in one breath made Sarah's lips twitch with the first hint of a smile she'd felt all day, while the man gently placed his hand on his daughter's shoulder and said, "Zoe, sweetheart, let's wait for the young lady to answer." But his eyes were twinkling with amusement at his daughter's excitement, and Sarah found herself nodding slowly, surprised by her own response as she said, "Sure, you can sit," her voice coming out rusty from not talking to anyone all day. And Marcus helped Zoe into the chair across from Sarah before sitting down himself, immediately noticing not just the cake but the way Sarah's shoulders were hunched as if she was trying to make herself smaller, the way her eyes kept darting to her phone, hoping for a message from her father, and without making a big deal of it, he called Maria over and said, "We'll have lunch for 3, please." And it's my treat for these two birthday girls. Which made Sarah start to protest, but he held up his hand gently and said, "Please, it would make us happy, wouldn't it, Zoe?" And the little girl nodded so enthusiastically that her beads clicked like tiny castanets, already pulling crayons from her backpack and starting to draw on the paper placemat, while chattering about how she loved chocolate cake, and did Sarah like chocolate cake too, and what was her favorite color, because Zoe's was purple, but sometimes it was pink depending on her mood. And slowly, without even realizing it was happening, Sarah found herself being drawn into conversation with this unusual pair who had appeared at just the moment when she needed them most, though she didn't quite understand yet that this was the beginning of something that would change not just this birthday, but every day that would follow. Marcus Williams settled into his chair with the easy grace of someone who had learned to make himself comfortable in any situation, his eyes taking in the details of Sarah's face, while Zoe immediately started arranging her crayons in rainbow order on the table. And he noticed how Sarah kept glancing at her phone screen, even though it remained dark and silent, so he gently said, "You know, Zoe and I have a tradition where we share our birthday cake with someone new every year, because her mother used to say that cake tastes better when it's shared." Which made Sarah look up sharply, because there was something in his voice when he mentioned Zoe's mother that she recognized. A particular kind of sadness that had become familiar to her, and Zoe piped up without missing a beat. "Mommy went to heaven 2 years ago, but Daddy says she still watches us and sends us signs, like finding lucky pennies or meeting new friends on special days." And the innocent way she said it made Sarah's chest tighten, because this little girl understood loss too, yet she was still so bright and full of life. And Marcus quickly steered the conversation by asking Sarah about school and her interests, genuinely listening as she hesitantly mentioned that she used to love painting but hadn't touched her brushes since the accident, the words slipping out before she could stop them, and she immediately tensed, waiting for the typical adult response of pity or awkward silence. But Marcus simply nodded and said, "I understand that feeling when something you love becomes connected to difficult memories." While Zoe had stopped coloring and was looking at Sarah's wheelchair with curious eyes, not with the staring that made Sarah uncomfortable, but with genuine interest. And then Zoe asked, quite matter-of-factly, "Is that why you're in a wheelchair, because something difficult happened?" And before Marcus could gently redirect his daughter, Sarah found herself answering honestly, "Yes, I was in a car accident 3 years ago." And Zoe nodded solemnly, then pushed her wrapped present across the table, saying, "This was supposed to be for my friend Emma at school, but I think you need it more, and besides, Emma already has everything." Which made Marcus start to protest, but Zoe gave him a look that was surprisingly firm for an 8-year-old, and Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she unwrapped the gift to find a beautiful set of watercolor paints and brushes, the expensive kind that her father used to buy her before everything changed. And she looked up with tears, threatening to spill. "I can't accept this." But Zoe had already grabbed a clean napkin and was spreading it out like a canvas, dipping one of the brushes in her water glass and saying, "Show me how to paint something, please. I'm terrible at it, and Mrs. Anderson at school says I need practice." Which was clearly a lie, because the drawing on her placemat showed real talent. But Sarah found herself taking the brush with hands that remembered the motion even after 3 years. And as she showed Zoe how to make simple flower petals with the water creating soft edges on the napkin, Marcus watched with a knowing smile and mentioned casually, "You know, I work as a physical therapist at the rehabilitation center downtown, and we have an art therapy program there that's specifically designed for young people working through physical challenges." Making Sarah's hand pause mid-stroke as he continued, "The instructor is actually a wheelchair user herself, a former patient who became a professional artist after her injury, and she's always looking for young people who show genuine talent." And Sarah felt something flutter in her chest that might have been hope, but she quickly pushed it down, because hope had become dangerous lately, too easy to crush. But Zoe wasn't having any of that caution, as she exclaimed, "Oh, Daddy, could Sarah come with us to the center sometime because you're always saying you wish more young people would join the program?" And Marcus gave his daughter a gentle look that said she wasn't being as subtle as she thought she was. But he turned to Sarah and said, "The invitation is genuine, no pressure at all, but if you're interested, we're there every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon." And just then Maria arrived with their food, having somehow intuited what everyone might like, placing a burger and fries in front of Zoe, who cheered quietly, a soup and sandwich near Marcus, and a pasta dish that happened to be Sarah's favorite in front of her, though she hadn't ordered it, and Maria winked, saying, "Birthday girls get their favorites, no arguments," before bustling away. And as they began eating, the conversation flowed more naturally, with Zoe telling stories about her hamster's escape attempts and Marcus sharing funny stories from his work, carefully choosing ones that showed how his patients overcame challenges rather than dwelling on difficulties. And Sarah found herself laughing, really laughing, when Zoe did an impression of Mr. Whiskers trying to stuff an entire carrot in his cheek pouches, and she realized she couldn't remember the last time she had laughed like this. Probably not since before the accident, and Marcus noticed the change in her posture, how she was sitting straighter, engaging more, the light returning to her eyes bit by bit. And he exchanged a meaningful glance with Zoe, who beamed back at him with pride, because even at 8 years old, she understood they were doing something important here, and Sarah was just reaching for another napkin to show Zoe how to paint. Clouds when her phone suddenly lit up with a text from her father saying he was on his way, but would probably be another hour. And her face fell slightly, until Zoe grabbed her hand and said, "Good, that means we have more time to paint and eat cake together." As if Sarah's father being late was actually the best news ever, and Marcus added quietly, "Sometimes the best moments happen when our original plans fall through," which made Sarah look at him with surprise, because most adults would have said something negative about her father not showing up. But Marcus seemed to understand that she didn't need anyone else criticizing her dad. She did enough of that, in her own head. And as she watched Zoe carefully trying to copy the cloud technique while her tongue stuck out in concentration, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in so long she'd almost forgotten what it was called, which was the feeling of being seen not as a tragedy or a reminder of loss, but just as herself, a girl who happened to be in a wheelchair, but who was so much more than that. And when Marcus mentioned that Zoe had been asking for an art buddy 4 months, and kept complaining that none of her friends at school really understood art the way she wanted to, Sarah heard herself saying, "I could maybe help with that," which made Zoe literally bounce in her seat with excitement. And Marcus smiled that warm smile again, saying, "I think that would be wonderful." And none of them noticed that other restaurant patrons were watching their table with soft smiles, seeing what appeared to be a family enjoying a birthday celebration, not knowing they were witnessing the first moments of a connection that would grow into something none of them could have imagined. As they continued eating and painting on napkins that were slowly covering the entire table like a makeshift art gallery, Marcus began sharing more about his work at the rehabilitation center, his voice taking on a passionate tone as he described how he had started specializing in pediatric physical therapy after his wife Angela had become ill, because watching her fight through her illness with such grace had taught him that the human spirit was capable of incredible things when given the right support and encouragement. And Sarah found herself leaning forward, genuinely interested, as he explained how he worked with young people who had suffered spinal injuries, amputations, and various other physical challenges. But what struck her most was how he never used words like disabled or handicapped, but instead talked about different abilities and new ways of moving through the world. And Zoe chimed in with her own stories about the friends she had made at the center, including a boy named Tyler who could paint holding brushes with his toes, and a girl named Maria who had designed her own wheelchair that looked like a racing car. And Sarah felt something shifting inside her as she realized there was a whole world of people like her who weren't just surviving but actually thriving. And Marcus noticed her processing this information, so he gently shared, "You know, when Angela was going through her chemotherapy, she used to say that the worst part wasn't the physical pain, but the way people looked at her, like she had already become a ghost, and she made me promise that when she was gone, I would help other people see that facing challenges doesn't make you less than anyone else. It just makes you different, and different can be beautiful." And his eyes misted slightly as he spoke, but his voice remained steady, while Zoe reached over and patted his hand in a gesture that seemed too mature for her age, clearly something they had done many times before. And then Zoe turned to Sarah and said very seriously, "Daddy cries sometimes, and that's okay because he says tears are just love with nowhere else to go," which made Sarah's own eyes well up because she hadn't cried properly since the accident, always trying to be strong for her father, who seemed so broken himself. And Marcus seemed to sense this internal struggle because he said quietly, "It's okay to feel everything you're feeling, Sarah. Anger, sadness, frustration. They're all valid, and they don't make you weak, they make you human." And something about the way he said it, without any judgment or expectation, made Sarah's carefully built walls start to crumble. And she found herself telling them things she hadn't told anyone, about how her father couldn't look at her without seeing the accident, how her old friends didn't know how to act around her anymore, how she felt like she had become invisible, except for the wheelchair, which seemed to be all anyone saw. And Marcus and Zoe listened without interrupting, without trying to fix everything with empty platitudes, just letting her words flow out, like water breaking through a dam. And when she finally stopped, feeling embarrassed about sharing so much with strangers, Zoe simply said, "Well, we see you, and you're really cool, and really good at art, and really pretty too," with such sincere conviction that Sarah couldn't help but smile through her tears. And Marcus added, "You know what I see? I see a young woman who has survived something traumatic and is still here, still fighting, even when it would be easier to give up. And that takes a kind of courage that most people will never have to find in themselves." And he pulled out his phone, showing her videos of some of his patients with their permission, including a teenage girl named Rebecca, who had been paralyzed in a diving accident and was now competing in wheelchair basketball while also running an online art business, and another boy named James, who had lost his leg to cancer but had become a motivational speaker who visited schools to talk about resilience. And Sarah watched these videos with growing amazement, seeing people who looked genuinely happy, not the forced happiness she had learned to paste on for others' comfort, but real joy. And she asked hesitantly, "But how do they get past the anger? Because sometimes I feel so angry I could scream." And Marcus nodded understanding. "They don't get past it. They work through it. Big difference. And having the right support system makes all the difference." Then he looked at her seriously and said, "Sarah, I don't believe in coincidences. I think Zoe and I were meant to meet you today, and not to sound presumptuous, but I'd really like to help if you'll let us." And before Sarah could respond, the restaurant door chimed, and she saw her father's reflection in the window. But instead of the usual anxiety she felt when he arrived late to something, she felt oddly calm, even protective of this moment she was sharing with Marcus and Zoe. And Marcus must have followed her gaze, because he said quietly, "That's your father." And when she nodded, he said, "He looks like a man carrying the weight of the world," which was exactly what Sarah had been thinking, but could never articulate. And Zoe, who had been watching the door, suddenly announced, "He looks sad, like Daddy used to look before we started helping people," which was such an innocent but profound observation that both Marcus and Sarah looked at her in surprise. And Marcus squeezed his daughter's hand before saying to Sarah, "Sometimes parents need help too, they just don't know how to ask for it." And Sarah realized that all this time she had been waiting for her father to save her from her isolation. But maybe, just maybe, they needed to save each other. And as David Chen approached their table, his expensive suit slightly rumpled and his face showing the exhaustion of someone who had been running from his grief for 3 years, Sarah made a decision that would change everything, and instead of the usual tense greeting she would give him, she smiled and said, "Dad, I want you to meet my new friends, Marcus and Zoe. They've been keeping me company and teaching me that birthdays can still be magical." And the way his face changed, the surprise mixed with something that looked like relief, and maybe even hope, made her realize that he had been just as lost as she was, just as desperate for someone to show them a way forward. And as Marcus stood to shake her father's hand, something passed between the two men, a recognition of shared loss and shared love for their daughters. And Sarah thought that maybe, just maybe, this birthday that had started as the worst one ever might actually become the one where everything began to change. David Chen stood frozen for a moment as Marcus extended his hand, his mind trying to process the scene before him where his daughter, who had been withdrawing more and more into herself over the past 3 years, was sitting with strangers while the table was covered and painted. Napkins in her face showed traces of tears, but also something else he hadn't seen in so long he'd almost forgotten what it looked like, which was genuine happiness. And as he shook Marcus's hand, he felt the firm grip of someone who worked with their hands. Someone real and grounded in a way that David hadn't felt since he'd thrown himself into his work to escape the crushing grief of losing his wife and watching his daughter struggle. And Marcus said warmly, "Your daughter is remarkable, Mr. Chen. She's been teaching Zoe about watercolor techniques and showing incredible patience with an 8-year-old's enthusiasm." And David's eyes moved to the little girl, who was beaming up at him with gap-toothed smile, and she announced, "Sarah is my new best friend and she's going to teach me art every week, and Daddy says we can bring her to the center where he works because she's really talented and talents shouldn't be wasted." All in one breath that made David blink in surprise, and he looked at Sarah, who was watching him carefully, waiting for his reaction, probably expecting him to make excuses about why weekly art lessons wouldn't work with their schedule, or his schedule, or any of the dozens of reasons he usually gave for why things couldn't happen. But something about this moment, about seeing his daughter engaged with life again, made him pull out the chair and sit down, his expensive phone buzzing insistently in his pocket. But for once he ignored it completely, and he said, "Tell me about this center," which made Marcus and Sarah exchange a surprised glance. And Marcus began explaining about the rehabilitation center's programs, how they combined physical therapy with creative expression, how they had seen remarkable results with young people who had experienced trauma, both physical and emotional. And, as he spoke, David found himself really listening, not the half attention he usually gave while mentally reviewing quarterly reports, but actually hearing how Marcus described the way art could help rewire neural pathways, how community support could accelerate healing, how having peers who understood your challenges could make the difference between merely surviving and actually living. And Zoe interrupted to add helpful details like, "They have a really cool art room with tables that move up and down so everyone can reach them. And there's a garden where people can paint outside when it's nice. And last week someone brought therapy puppies," which made Sarah actually laugh. And the sound hit David like a physical blow, because he realized how long it had been since he'd heard his daughter's real laugh. Not the polite one she used when his business associates made jokes, but genuine joy. And he felt something crack inside his chest, the wall he'd built to contain his grief starting to crumble. And Marcus seemed to sense his internal struggle, because he said quietly, "Mr. Chen, if you don't mind me saying, I recognize the look in your eyes, because I saw it in my mirror for months after Angela passed. That feeling of being responsible for everyone's healing except your own." And David's breath caught because this stranger had just articulated what he'd been unable to admit, even to himself. And Zoe, with the innocent wisdom of children, added, "Daddy was really sad after Mommy went to heaven, but he said, helping other people helped him remember how to be happy again." And she reached across the table to pat David's hand, the same way she had done with her father earlier. And David felt tears threatening to spill. which horrified him because he was CEO David Chen, who never showed weakness, who had built a tech empire on being analytical and controlled. But Sarah reached over and took his other hand, saying softly, "It's okay, Dad, they understand." And those 4 words broke through 3 years of carefully maintained control, and he found himself crying in a family restaurant, not caring who saw, while his daughter held one hand and a stranger's child held the other, and Marcus simply sat there offering the gift of non-judgmental presence. And when David finally composed himself, wiping his eyes with the napkin that Zoe helpfully provided, he looked at his daughter and said the words he'd been unable to say for 3 years. "I'm so sorry, Sarah. I'm sorry I haven't been there. I'm sorry I've been so afraid of losing you too that I stopped seeing you, really seeing you." And Sarah started crying too, but these were different tears than the ones she'd been holding back earlier. These were tears of release and relief, and she said, "I needed you, Dad, not your money or the expensive specialists. Just you." And David pulled her into a hug, awkward because of the wheelchair, but real in a way their interactions hadn't been since before the accident. And when they separated, both of them embarrassed but also lighter somehow, Marcus cleared his throat and said, "You know, the center runs a family program too, where parents and children work together on projects, learning to communicate through creating something together." And David surprised himself by saying, "What day and time?" without any hesitation. And when Marcus said Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, David pulled out his phone, but instead of checking his messages, he called his assistant right there at the table and said, "Block out every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, starting immediately. No exceptions, no emergency meetings, nothing." And the shock in his assistant's voice was audible, even from across the table. But David just repeated firmly, "No exceptions," before hanging up. And Sarah stared at him in amazement, because her father hadn't taken a regular afternoon off in 3 years, and Zoe clapped her hands with delight, saying, "This is the best birthday ever, and it's not even my birthday anymore," which made everyone laugh. And Marcus suggested, "How about we all have some of that birthday cake to celebrate?" And David noticed for the first time the half-melted candle in the chocolate cake, evidence of his daughter's lonely birthday wish, and he felt fresh guilt wash over him. But Sarah seemed to read his mind because she said, "It's okay, Dad, my wish came true anyway." And when he looked confused, she smiled and said, "I wished for things to change, for something to be different." And then Marcus and Zoe showed up, and Zoe piped up. It was magic, birthday magic, with such conviction that even pragmatic David found himself believing in the possibility of magic. And as they shared the chocolate cake, with Zoe insisting on singing happy birthday again, but this time to both Sarah and her father, because everyone needs a birthday song, David felt something he hadn't experienced since before losing his wife, which was hope, not the false hope of medical miracles or technological solutions, but the genuine hope that came from human connection, from realizing that healing didn't mean forgetting the pain but learning to carry it together. And as he watched his daughter showing Zoe how to make chocolate frosting into paint for another napkin masterpiece while Marcus shared stories about the center's upcoming art exhibition, David understood that this moment, this unexpected encounter with strangers who had somehow become more than that in the span of a single lunch, was the beginning of finding their way back to being a family again. Not the same family they had been before, but perhaps something even stronger, because it would be built on truth and vulnerability, rather than pretense and avoidance. 6 months later, Sarah rolled her wheelchair confidently through the community center's main entrance, the automatic doors sliding open to reveal a gallery space transformed with bright lights and walls covered in artwork, while David walked beside her, carrying a box of programs he had personally helped design and print. And Marcus stood near the entrance, greeting visitors with Zoe bouncing excitedly beside him, wearing a dress she had painted herself with fabric paints Sarah had taught her to use. And the banner overhead read Unlimited Perspectives, an exhibition of extraordinary artists, which was the name, Sarah had suggested during one of their Thursday sessions, when the four of them had become something that looked remarkably like a family, though no one had put that exact word on it yet. And as Sarah positioned herself near her painting, the centerpiece of the exhibition that showed three people sharing cake at a restaurant table with light streaming through the window, behind them creating halos around their heads. She remembered how difficult those first weeks at the center had been, how her muscles had protested the new physical therapy routines Marcus had designed specifically for her, how her father had struggled to let go of his phone during their art sessions until Zoe had instituted a phone jail where all devices had to be locked in a drawer, and how she herself had fought against hoping too much, even as she felt herself getting stronger, both physically and emotionally. And now here she was, not just displaying her art, but serving as a mentor to three younger kids who had recently joined the program, including a 10-year-old boy named Alex, who had lost his leg in an accident and painted the most incredible landscapes using adapted brushes Marcus had helped him design. And Sarah watched as visitors stopped at each painting, reading the artist's statements that told their stories, not of limitation, but of discovery. And she saw her father deep in conversation with a reporter from the local news, not giving his usual CEO soundbites, but speaking from the heart about how this program had saved his family, how Marcus had taught him that strength wasn't about pretending everything was fine, but about admitting when you needed help. And across the room, she caught Marcus's eye, and he gave her that warm smile that had become as familiar as breathing over these past months. The same smile he wore when she had taken her first independent transfer from her wheelchair to a regular chair, when she had completed her first full painting without needing any adaptive equipment, when she had stood using the parallel bars, for the first time with Zoe cheering so loudly that everyone in the center had come to watch. And speaking of Zoe, she was now dragging someone's grandmother over to see Sarah's painting, explaining in her authoritative voice, "This is my best friend Sarah, and she painted this on my birthday, except it was actually her birthday too, and that's when Daddy and I met her and her dad, and now we have dinner together every Sunday, and Sarah teaches me art, and I teach her how to take care of hamsters, because she's getting one next week," which made the elderly woman smile and nod, while Sarah tried not to laugh at Zoe's determination that Sarah needed a hamster in her life. And then Sarah noticed a familiar figure entering the gallery, Rebecca, the wheelchair basketball player from Marcus's videos, now a successful artist whose work was showing in galleries across the state. And she rolled directly to Sarah with a knowing grin, saying, "So you're the famous Sarah I've been hearing about. Marcus says you've got more natural talent than I did at your age," which made Sarah blush, but also swell with pride, because Rebecca had become something of a legend in the adaptive arts community. And they talked technique while David appeared with cups of juice for everyone, having learned to anticipate needs in a way that the old CEO version of himself never would have bothered with. And as the evening progressed, Sarah realized that every person she had met through the center was here, creating a web of connections that had caught her when she was falling and lifted her higher than she had ever imagined possible. And when it came time for the speeches, Marcus took the microphone but immediately called David up to join him, and the two men stood together like brothers, which in many ways they had become. And Marcus spoke about the power of community, while David talked about the corporate sponsorship program he was launching to ensure that no child would be turned away from the center due to inability to pay. And then they called Sarah and Zoe up, and Sarah felt no anxiety as she rolled up the ramp they had installed just for tonight, taking the microphone with steady hands, and she looked out at the crowd of faces, some in wheelchairs, some with prosthetics, some with invisible challenges that only showed in their eyes. And she said, "6 months ago, I was alone on my birthday, feeling like my life was over at 12 years old. And then 2 strangers asked to sit at my table. And that simple act of kindness changed everything, not because they fixed me, because I was never broken, but because they saw me, really saw me, and helped me remember who I was beyond my circumstances." and her voice was strong and clear as she continued. This art, these friendships, this community, they haven't erased what happened to me, but they've shown me that our stories don't end with our traumas. They evolve, they grow, they become something beautiful, if we let them, if we're brave enough to pick up the brush and keep painting even when our hands shake. And the applause was thunderous, but what mattered more to Sarah was the way her father was crying openly, the way Marcus nodded with proud approval, the way Zoe was jumping up and down chanting, "That's my best friend," and the way everyone in the room understood exactly what she meant, because they were living their own versions of the same story. And later, as the evening wound down, and people started leaving with purchased artwork and renewed hope, Sarah found herself back at her painting with her father, Marcus, and Zoe, and David said quietly, "You know, someone wants to buy this piece for quite a substantial sum," but Sarah shook her head, saying, "It's not for sale, it's going home with us, all of us." And the way she said it, the inclusion of Marcus and Zoe, as naturally as breathing, made something shift in the air, and Marcus cleared his throat and said, "Actually, I've been meaning to talk to you both about something," but Zoe interrupted with her perfect timing. "Daddy wants to know if we can be a real family, because I need a sister and Mr. David needs someone to teach him how to relax, and Sarah needs us, and we need them, and it just makes sense." And the adults all started laughing while trying to speak at once. But Sarah reached out and took her father's hand with one of hers, and Marcus's with the other, while Zoe completed the circle, and she said simply, "Yes, because sometimes the most profound changes in life came not from grand gestures or dramatic moments, but from the simple act of saying yes to love in whatever form it arrived, whether it was a stranger offering to share your birthday cake, or a new family forming from the ashes of loss." And as they stood there in their circle, the painting behind them capturing the moment where everything had started, Sarah realized that the title she had given the piece, "The Day Everything Changed," had been wrong, because it wasn't just that one day. It was every day since, every choice to show up, to be vulnerable, to trust, to try again. And as they finally headed out into the evening air, Marcus carrying the painting while David pushed Sarah's wheelchair and Zoe skipped ahead, singing a made-up song about hamsters and birthdays and families that choose each other, Sarah understood that sometimes the universe's greatest gifts came disguised as interruptions to your loneliness, and all you had to do was make room at your table and say yes.